going. There was a dirt road up ahead she could follow a ways, and then cross over onto the road that was paved all the way to the coffee barns. The woman pointed south in the direction of the big house. Many workers took that shortcut to work. They piled into the car, half a dozen boys in the back, and Jose as co-pilot in the passenger seat beside Yolanda. They turned onto a bumpy road off the highway, which got bumpier and bumpier, and climbed up into wilder, more desolate country. Branches scraped the sides, and pebbles pelted the underside of the car. Yolanda wanted to turn back, but there was no room to maneuver the car around. Finally, with a great snapping of twigs and thrashing of branches across the windshield, as if the countryside were loath to release them, the car burst forth onto smooth pavement and the light of day. On either side of the road were groves of guava trees. Among them, the boys who had gone ahead on foot were already pulling down branches and shaking loose a rain of guavas. The fruit was definitely in season. For the next hour or so, Yolanda and her crew scavenged the grove, the best of the pick going into the beach basket Yolanda had gotten out of the trunk, with the exception of the ones she ate right on the spot, relishing the slightly bumpy feel of the skin in her hand, devouring the crunchy, sweet white meat. The boys watched her, surprised by her odd hunger. Yolanda and Jose, partners, wandered far from the path that cut through the grove. Soon they were bent double to avoid getting entangled in the thick canopy of branches overhead. Each addition to the basket caused a spill from the stash already piled high above the brim. Finally, it was a case of abandoning the treasure in order to cart some of it home. With Jose hugging the basket to himself and Yolanda parting the wayward branches in front of them, they headed back toward the car. When they finally cleared the thicket of guava branches, the sun was low on the western horizon. There was no sign of the other boys. They must have gone to round up the goats, Jose observed. Yolanda glanced at her watch. It was past 6 o'clock. She'd never make the north coast by nightfall, but at least she could get off the dangerous mountain roads while it was still light. She hurried Jose back to the car, where they found a heap of guavas the other boys had left behind on the shoulder of the road. Enough guavas to appease even the greediest island spirit for life. They packed the guavas in the trunk quickly and climbed in, but the car had not gone a foot before it lurched forward with a horrible hobble. Yolanda closed her eyes and laid her head down on the wheel, then glanced over at Jose. The way his eyes were searching the inside of the car for a clue as to what could have happened, she could tell he didn't know how to change a flat tire either. It was no use regretting having brought the car up that bad stretch of road. The thing to do now was to act quickly. Soon the sun would set and night would fall swiftly. No lingering dusk as in the States. She explained to Jose that they had a flat tire and had to hike back to town and send for help down the road to the big house. Whoever tended to the brown Mercedes would know how to change the tire on her car. With your permission, Jose offered meekly. He pointed down the paved road. This goes directly to the big house. The doña could just wait in the car, and he would be back in no time with someone from the Miranda place. She did not like the idea of staying behind in the car, but Jose could probably go and come back much quicker without her. "All right," she said to the boy. "I'll tell you what." She pointed to her watch. It was almost 6:30. "If you're back by the time this hand is over here, I'll give you," She held up one finger. $1. The boy's mouth fell open. In no time, he had shot out of his side of the car and was headed at a run toward the Miranda place. Yolanda climbed out as well and walked down a pace until the boy had disappeared in one of the turnings of the road. Suddenly, the countryside was so very quiet. She looked up at the purple sky. A breeze was blowing through the grove, rustling the leaves so they whispered like voices, something indistinct. Here and there a light flickered on the hills, a campesino living out his solitary life. This was what she had been missing without really knowing that she was missing it all these years. She had never felt at home in the States, never, though she knew she was lucky to have a job so she could afford her own life and not be run by her family. But independence didn't have to be exile. She could come home, home to places like these very hills, and live here on her own terms. Heading back to the car, Yolanda stopped. She had heard footsteps in the grove. Could Jose be back already? Branches were being thrust aside. Twigs snapped. Suddenly, a short, dark man, and then a slender, light-skinned man emerged from a footpath on the opposite side of the grove from the one she and Jose had scavenged. They wore ragged work clothes stained with patches of sweat. Their faces were drawn and tired. Yolanda's glance fell on the machetes that hung from their belts. The men's faces snapped awake from their stupor at the sight of her. They looked beyond her at the car. "Yours?" The darker man spoke first. It struck her, even then, as an absurd question. Who else's would it be here in the middle of nowhere? "Is there some problem?" The darker man spoke up again. The taller one was looking her up and down with interest. They were now both in front of her on the road, blocking her escape. Both, she had looked them up and down as well, were strong and quite capable of catching her if she made a run for the Mirandas. Not that she could have moved, for her legs seemed suddenly to have been hammered into the ground beneath her. She thought of explaining that she was just out for a drive before dinner at the big house, so that these men would think someone knew where she was. Someone would come looking for her if they tried to carry her off. But she found she could not speak. Her tongue felt as if it had been stuffed in her mouth, like a rag, to keep her quiet.
Now, of course, you'll have here Alvarez creating tension as a writer in this story, where you have a situation now where she's up on the hill, she's all alone now, the young boy has run off, the tire obviously is flat on the car, and now we've got a situation where you got two guys. So the tension, as we said, remember we said we were going to focus on conflict here, so the tension's starting to mount in our story, correct? Again, what's the title of our story? Antojos. What's the meaning of this Spanish word? Cravings or desires. Of course, this is what led her to try and go and find the fruit in the first place. And now all of a sudden we've got this interesting dynamic in play. What's going to happen next? Go ahead and pause for a moment at level 1 and try and make a prediction really quickly. What do you think is going to happen next? Are we being set up as readers and these are going to be good guys? Or in fact, are these not so good guys? Jot down what you think is about to happen. We're on page 1305 now. Let's go ahead and finish the ending of our story, all right? Let's concentrate and follow along with our reading, okay? Here we go. Let's go to work.
The men exchanged a look, it seemed to Yolanda, of collusion.
Collusion, trying to figure out together.
The shorter, darker one spoke up again. "Senorita, are you all right?" He peered at her. The darkness of his complexion in the growing darkness of the evening made it difficult to distinguish an expression. He was no taller than Yolanda, but he gave the impression of being quite large, for he was broad and solid, like something not yet completely carved out of a piece of wood. His companion was tall, and of a rich honey-brown color that matched his honey-brown eyes. Anywhere else, Yolanda would have found him extremely attractive, but here, on a lonely road, with the sky growing darker by seconds, his good looks seemed dangerous, a lure to catch her off her guard. "Can we help you?" the shorter man repeated. The handsome one smiled knowingly. Two long, deep dimples appeared like gashes on either side of his mouth. "Americana," he said to the other in Spanish, pointing to the car. "She doesn't understand." The darker man narrowed his eyes and studied Yolanda a moment. "Americana?" he asked her, as if not quite sure what to make of her. She had been too frightened to carry out any strategy, but now a road was opening before her. She laid her hand on her chest. She could feel her pounding heart, and nodded. Then, as if the admission itself loosened her tongue, she explained in English how it came that she was on a back road by herself, her craving for guavas, her never having learned to change a flat. The two men stared at her, uncomprehendingly, rendered docile by her gibberish. Strangely enough, it soothed her to hear herself speaking something they could not understand. She thought of something her teacher used to say to her when, as a young immigrant girl, she was learning English. Language is power. It was her only defense now. Yolanda made the motions of pumping. The darker man looked at the other, who had shown better luck at understanding the foreign lady. But his companion shrugged, baffled as well. "I'll show you." Yolanda waved for them to follow her. And suddenly, as if after pulling and pulling at roots, she had finally managed to yank them free of the soil they had clung to, she found she could move her own feet forward to the car. The small group stood staring at the sagging tire a moment, the two men kicking at it as if punishing it for having failed the Senorita. They squatted by the passenger's side, conversing in low tones. Yolanda led them to the rear of the car, where the men lifted the spare out of its sunken nest, then set to work, fitting the interlocking pieces of the jack, unpacking the tools from the deeper hollows of the trunk. They laid their machetes down on the side of the road, out of the way. Yolanda turned on the headlights to help them see in the growing darkness. Above the small group, the sky was purple with twilight. There was a problem with the jack. It squeaked and labored, but the car would not rise. The shorter man squirmed his way underneath and placed the mechanism deeper under the bowels of the car. There he pumped vigorously, his friend bracing him by holding him down by the ankles. Slowly, the car rose until the wheel hung suspended. When the man came out from under the car, his hand was bloody where his knuckles had scraped against the pavement. Yolanda pointed to the man's hand. She had been sure that if any blood were going to be spilled tonight, it would be hers. She offered him the towel she kept draped on her car seat to absorb her perspiration, but he waved it away and sucked his knuckles to make the bleeding stop. Once the flat had been replaced with a spare, the two men lifted the deflated tire into the trunk and put away the tools. They handed Yolanda her keys. There was still no sign of Jose and the Mirandas. Yolanda was relieved. As she had waited, watching the two men hard at work, she had begun to dread the boy's return with help. The two men would realize she spoke Spanish. It was too late to admit that she had tricked them, to explain she had done so only because she thought her survival was on the line. The least she could do now was to try and repay them handsomely for their trouble. "I'd like to give you something." She began reaching for the purse she'd retrieved from the trunk. The English word sounded hollow on her tongue. She rolled up a couple of American bills and offered them to the men. The shorter man held up his hand. Yolanda could see where the blood had dried dark streaks on his palm. "No, no, señorita. Nuestro placer." Our pleasure. Yolanda turned to the other man, who had struck her as more pliant than his sterner companion. "Please," she urged the bills on him. But he too looked down at the ground with the bashfulness she had observed in José of country people not wanting to offend. She felt the poverty of her response and stuffed the bills quickly into his pocket. The two men picked up their machetes and raised them to their shoulders like soldiers their guns. The tall man motioned towards the big house. "Directo, directo." He enunciated the words carefully. Yolanda looked in the direction of his hand. In the faint light of what was left of day, she could barely make out the road ahead. It was as if the guava grove had overgrown into the road and woven its mat of branches so securely and tightly in all directions she would not be able to escape. But finally, she was off. While the two men waited a moment on the shoulder to see if the tire would hold, Yolanda drove a few yards, poking her head out the window before speeding up. "Gracias," she called, and they waved appreciatively at the foreign lady making an effort in their native tongue. When she looked for them in her rear-view mirror, they had disappeared into the darkness of the guava grove. Just ahead, her lights described the figure of a small boy. José was walking alone, listlessly, as if he did not particularly want to get to where he was going. Yolanda leaned over and opened the door for him. The small overhead light came on. She saw that the boy's face was streaked with tears. "Why, what's wrong, José?" The boy swallowed hard. "They would not come. They didn't believe me." He took little breaths between words to keep his tears at bay. He had lost his chance at a whole $1. "And the guard? He said if I didn't stop telling stories, he was going to whip me." "What did you tell him, José?" "I told him you had broken your car and you needed help fixing it." She should have gone along with José to the Mirandas. Given all the trouble in the country, they would be suspicious of a boy coming to their door at nightfall with some story about a lady on a back road with a broken car. "Don't you worry, José." Yolanda patted the boy. She could feel the bony shoulder through the thin fabric of his worn shirt. "You can still have your $1. You did your part." But the shame of being suspected of lying seemed to have obscured any immediate pleasure he might feel in her offer. Yolanda tried to distract him by asking what he would buy with his money, what he most craved, thinking that on a subsequent trip she might bring him his little antojo. But José Duarte Sánchez y Mella said nothing, except a bashful thank you when she left him off at the cantina with his promised $1. In the glow of the headlights, Yolanda made out the figure of the old woman in the black square of her doorway, waving goodbye. Above the picnic table, on a near post, the Palmolive woman's skin shone. Her head was thrown back, her mouth opened, as if she were calling someone over a great distance.
Let's pause for a moment now and just go back to 1301, the geography, connection, literature, and context, and read that with me on page 1301. You can see a little map there to kind of tell you where this story is set. Do you see it on 1301? The Dominican Republic, located in the West Indies. The Dominican Republic takes up the eastern two-thirds of the island of Hispaniola. The country is bounded on the north by the Atlantic Ocean, on the east by the Moña Passage, which separates it from Puerto Rico, on the south by the Caribbean Sea, and on the west by Haiti. Do you see it? In Alvarez's story, Yolanda begins her journey in Santo Domingo, the capital city, which is located on the country's southern coast. Do you see it? Yolanda's journey takes her into the Central Range, which includes the highest mountain in the Caribbean, right? The Pico Duardo. The slopes of many of these mountains are covered with dense semi-tropical forests like those in which Yolanda searches for her guavas. Okay? And then, of course, the connected literature. In what ways does the story setting, both geographical and cultural, contribute to Yolanda's conflict? Okay, now let's pause for a moment and just jot down at level 1 what this story for you is about. So let's work at level 1 really quickly. Of course, we can say it pretty simply. Notice that the story begins with her driving her car alone. It's kind of a 4-part dance, isn't it, for our story? Driving her car alone, she pulls over to the side of the road. She sees these men in the truck. They all start waving at her, which is going to obviously set up her, you know, her moment with the 2 men alone later. She then arrives in the mountains. She asks for some help finding this fruit that she's looking for, this guavas. She is going to be helped by a young boy. Part 3 of the story, of course, will be her breaking down and needing some help to try and figure out what's going on with her car. And then finally, the final part of the story, after the 2 men have helped her, the final part of the story is the young boy upset that no one would believe him. He gets his dollar and off she goes. So it's a simple story in that regards. Now let's jump to 2A really quickly and ask about messages, themes. Notice everything is driven, of course, by this title. Right? Antojos, which means cravings or desires. And so we can jot down a couple of different major messages or themes that are associated with this. By the way, notice when we get to 2B, we're going to have to ask about this palm olive